before she became part of a headline, before investigators ever knew her name, before this case captured national attention, there was simply Reagan. Friends remember Reagan as someone who made people feel welcome. She loved photography, not just taking pictures, but preserving moments that families would treasure for years to come. If you've ever looked through an old family photograph book, you know exactly what that means. Pictures freeze time. They remind us where we've been, who we've loved, and who we never want to forget. It's fitting in a bittersweet way that someone who spent so much of her life preserving memories would leave behind so many beautiful memories of her own. In 2020, Reagan was looking ahead to what she believed would be the greatest adventure of her life, motherhood. She and her husband, Homer, preparing to welcome their first child, a daughter they had already named Braxlin. Like so many first time parents, their days were filled with anticipation, doctor appointments, baby clothes, nursery plans, conversations about the future. Those ordinary moments that become extraordinary when you're expecting your first child. Can I tell you something?
Always.
As a mom, this is the part that gets me every time because I remember those days. Picking out baby clothes, talking about names, wondering who your child's going to look like, who you spend months imagining a future, and you don't even realize you're making memories while you're living them.
That was beautifully said, Mom.
Oh, thank
And I think that's why it's so important to begin here because Reagan wasn't simply the victim in today's story. She was living a life that so many of us recognize. She was building a family, making plans, dreaming about birthdays, first Christmases, first steps, first days of school. She wasn't thinking about danger. She was thinking about diapers and bottles and rocking a little girl to sleep. Unfortunately, someone else was thinking about babies too, but for a very different reason. Every lie has a beginning, but the most dangerous lies don't begin with words. They begin with a decision. A decision to let someone believe something that isn't true, then another and another until eventually the lie becomes easier to live than the truth. As investigators began looking into Taylor Parker's life, they discovered something important. The fake pregnancy wasn't the first deception. According to testimony presented during trial, it was part of a much longer pattern. But before we get there, let's look at what everyone else saw. Because if you had met Taylor in 2020, you probably wouldn't have thought anything was unusual. She talked about being pregnant, she discussed baby names, she shared updates, she appeared excited about becoming a mother. To the people around her, she looked like someone preparing for one of life's happiest moments. And that's exactly why this case has stayed with so many people. Not because someone lied, but because so many people believed the lie.
When I watched the documentary, I kept asking myself, how does someone fake?
That's a long time.
Okay. Can I tell you something? Always. As a mom, this is the part that gets me every time because I remember those days.
Mhm.
Picking out baby clothes, talking about names, wondering who your child's going to look like. You spend months imagining a future, and you don't even realize you're making memories while you're living them.
That was beautifully said, Nicole.
Thanks. Thanks. Amy.
You're welcome. Yeah. And I think that's why it's so important to begin here. Because Reagan wasn't simply the victim in today's story. She was living the life that so many of us recognize. She was building a family, making plans, dreaming about birthdays, first Christmases, first steps, first days of school. We've experienced all those first because obviously we're both moms.
Yes.
Your mom. She wasn't
Mhm.
thinking about danger. She was thinking about diapers and bottles and rocking a little girl to sleep. Unfortunately, someone else was thinking about babies too, but for a very different reason. Every lie has a beginning, but the most dangerous lies don't begin with words. They begin with a decision to let someone believe something that isn't true, and then another, until eventually the lie becomes easier to live than the truth. As investigators began looking into Taylor Parker's life, they discovered something important. The fake pregnancy wasn't the first deception. According to testimony during the trial, it was part of a much longer pattern. But before we get there, let's look at what everyone else saw. You probably wouldn't have thought anything was unusual. She looked like someone preparing for one of life's happiest moments, people. Lie.
Not a week, not a month, almost an entire pregnancy.
Picture. It required constant maintenance. Like every day, someone asked how far along you were, when was your next doctor's appointment, if the baby was kicking yet, and clearly you have to answer. And then you have to remember where you left off. So imagine having to wake up every morning knowing your entire day depends on remembering yesterday's story. That's got to be emotionally exhausting. And yet, according to testimony, the deception continued month after month.
Let's pause here for a second. Imagine you're the detective assigned to this case. You now know someone claimed to be pregnant. What would you want to verify first? Medical records, doctor's appointments, ultrasound, images, hospital visits? Those seem like obvious questions now. But remember, before 2020, no one had a reason to investigate a pregnancy. They had every reason to celebrate one. And that's something I think all of us can relate to. If a friend told me she was expecting, my first instinct wouldn't be suspicion. I would be excited.
Right. I think that that's a normal reaction. And that's one of the biggest lessons in this case because trust is no weakness. It's part of being human. Tragedy here isn't that people trusted, it's that someone chose to exploit that trust. As investigators continued digging into Taylor's background, they began hearing similar stories from different people. Witnesses described a pattern of deception that stretched back years.
Wow.
Court testimony included allegations of fabricated illnesses, false emergencies, financial deception, and previous false claims of pregnancy. So this was not her first time,
Right. Not a fresh rodeo.
which is insane. But it's important to be precise here because those weren't internet rumors. They were statements made under oath during the trial and presented as part of the prosecution's case. And the prosecution argued that those incidents demonstrated a long-standing pattern of manipulation. The defense challenged aspects of that narrative. Ultimately, it was up to the jury to decide how much weight to give that testimony. But knowing that this wasn't the first time that she was going around faking a pregnancy kind of is that's heavy.
This is a good place to separate fact from speculation. Cases like this often lead to people trying to diagnose someone they've never met. You'll hear terms like psychopath or sociopath used online and probably hear quite a bit today. But those aren't conclusions the jury was asked to make. What the jury did hear was testimony from mental health professionals who evaluated Taylor before trial. Experts discussed significant psychological issues and long-standing personality pathology, but they did not conclude that she met the legal standard for insanity. And that's an important distinction. Mental illness, personality disorders, and legal insanity are not interchangeable at all. Most people living with mental health conditions never commit violent crimes.
Exactly. Such as me.
Right? The question before the jury wasn't whether Taylor struggled psychologically, it was whether she understood the nature and wrongfulness of her actions. And I appreciate that distinction because it's easy to hear people say she had mental health issues and assume that explains everything, but it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. And it's important that we don't oversimplify something as complex as mental health. The evidence presented at trial suggested that whatever psychological struggles Taylor experienced, they did not prevent her from planning, making decisions, or understanding the consequences of her actions. Every pregnancy has something that can be postponed. A due date, as summer turned to fall, that date moved closer. Friends expected a birth announcement, family members expected to meet a baby. Her fiance believed he was about to become a father. The calendar doesn't care about deception, it keeps moving. And according to prosecutors, as that deadline approached, Taylor began searching for a solution. And it was a solution investigators would later reconstruct one digital breadcrumb at a time.
Every family has a moment when something doesn't feel quite right. Maybe it's a story that changes, a detail that doesn't add up, or simply a quiet feeling that you can't explain. We often call it a gut instinct. And sometimes those instincts are trying to tell us something important. As Taylor's claimed due date drew closer, questions began to surface, not from strangers, from people who cared, the people who loved her fiance, people who wanted the best for both of them. According to family members who later spoke publicly, including the Netflix documentary, they had growing concerns that Taylor wasn't actually pregnant. It wasn't one dramatic moment, it was a lot of small inconsistencies, details that didn't seem to fit, explanations that became harder to follow. At first, those concerns were just that, concerns. But as the weeks passed, they became difficult to ignore.
That's crazy though, to know that your people are looking at you like,
Well, like, I think it was his best friend in the documentary who was saying, like, he wasn't sure, he's a dude, so he's not really saying a lot, but he said he saw her in out in their driveway, and she didn't look pregnant at all, but she was supposed to be far along.
yeah,
So it was like things like that that people were noticing, and some people were telling him. And you know what stayed with me? It wasn't that they had questions. It was that they were willing to say them out loud.
right.
That couldn't have been easy.
No, I don't think that telling somebody, "Hey, I don't think your girl is actually pregnant," would be an
Mm,
easy conversation.
yeah.
I mean, because that's what they're questioning is a pregnancy, so, like, that's obviously deeply personal, and most of us would rather stay silent than risk accusing someone of something so serious if we weren't absolutely certain, so I'm sure that was a lot for the best friend to come forward.
Right.
But that's also what makes this part of the story so human, because speaking up carried its own risk. What if they were wrong?
Mhm.
Or what if there really was a misunderstanding? Because, I mean, those are heavy questions. Right. Let's put ourselves in his position for a moment, the fiance. Imagine you're preparing to become a father. You're excited, you're making plans, you're trusting the woman you love. Then someone close to you quietly says, something doesn't seem right.
Mm.
What do you do? Do you believe the people you've known your entire life or the person you're planning to build a future with? I don't know what I would have done, honestly. And I don't think that's an easy answer.
I don't either. Love has a way of making us want to believe the best about someone. That's not weakness, that's being human, really. We've
Yeah.
all been there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something I hope we all remember as we look back on this case. Hindsight is powerful, okay? Because we know how the story ends. The people living it didn't, though. And they were making decisions one day at a time with the information that they had. So pregnancy has one thing that deception doesn't, a timeline, like I said before. Every week brings another milestone, another doctor's appointment, another question from friends, another expectation. Eventually, the baby is obviously supposed to arrive.
Mhm.
But according to prosecutors, that approaching deadline became one of the defining pressures in this case. The life Taylor had presented to everyone around her was approaching the moment when it would have to become real or unravel. Investigators would later argue that as the due date approached, Taylor's online activity and planning reflected the growing pressure. Those details would become an important part of the prosecution timeline.
Looking back, it's easy to ask, why didn't someone stop this? But that's a question we can only ask because we already know the ending. The people involved didn't. Some family members had concerns. Some people remained convinced everything was fine, and others simply didn't know what to think. That's often how real life works. It's messy, it's uncertain, and sometimes people who care deeply about each other see the same situation very differently. And I think that's one of the hardest lessons in today's story. Sometimes your heart and your instincts don't agree.
And when that happens, it's one of the most difficult places a person can find themselves because which way do you go? You know? But by early October 2020, one family was counting down the days until they would finally meet a little girl named Braxlin. Another family was quietly wondering whether there would be a baby at all. Neither family could have imagined that the answers to those questions would arrive in the most heartbreaking way possible. The morning of October 9th began like any other Friday. By the end of the day, everything would be different. None of us know which ordinary day will become the day our family remembers forever. Reagan Simmons Hancock, October 9, 2020, began like any other Friday. She was 36 weeks pregnant, just weeks away from meeting the little girl she and Homer had already named Braxton. Like so many expectant mothers, she was preparing for a future that felt so close she could almost reach out and touch it. She had no reason to believe this day would be different from any other. But sometimes ordinary mornings become extraordinary tragedies, and no one knows it until it's too late.
That's one of the hardest things for me. Life doesn't announce that everything is about to change.
Right.
You wake up, drink your coffee, make your plans, and you assume you'll be home late.
Exactly, and that's what makes this story so heartbreaking because Reagan wasn't walking into something she believed was dangerous.
Mhm.
According to investigators, she agreed to meet someone she knew, someone who had photographed important moments in her life already, someone she believed she could trust. That trust is what brought them together that morning. Out of respect for Reagan, Braxton, and the people who loved him, we're not going to spend time describing the violence that followed. What matters is this: Reagan lost her life. Braxton lost hers. A husband lost his wife. Parents lost their daughter. Friends lost someone they loved. A future that had been carefully imagined was gone. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could.
Within hours, investigators were called to a scene that would forever change their community. At that moment, they didn't know about months of deception. They didn't know about a fake pregnancy, about growing concerns from family members. All they knew was that a young mother and her unborn daughter had been taken from the people who loved them. Their job now was to find the truth.
Every investigation begins with questions. What happened? Who was involved? Where does the evidence lead? Investigators secured the scene, photographed everything, collected physical evidence, interviewed witnesses, reviewed phone records, began building a timeline because a timeline often tells a story before a suspect ever does. Every minute mattered, every phone call mattered, every surveillance camera, receipt, text message had the potential to become one more piece of the puzzle. Th- Thank you.
Think television sometimes makes investigations look easy. One clue and suddenly everything falls into place. But that's not reality.
No, real investigations are patient. Sometimes detectives spend hours chasing one lead that goes nowhere, and other times, one tiny detail changes everything. The challenge is knowing the difference. And in this case, investigators would soon discover that technology had preserved a trail no one realized existed.
Let's imagine you're the lead investigator. You know Reagan met someone that day. Where do you begin? Do you look at phone records, surveillance cameras, vehicle movements, cell phone location data, interview everyone who spoke with her that morning? The answer is yes, because every interaction leaves a footprint, and detectives follow footprints until they become a path.
As investigators compared interviews with digital evidence, why do you keep going? That's my mouse's broke.
Oh,
I don't know why it's done it. They began noticing inconsistencies, stories that didn't line up, timelines that didn't quite fit. One inconsistency by itself doesn't solve a case, but several can point investigators towards the truth. What they were uncovering, what they were uncovering wasn't simply the events of one day. According to prosecutors, they were uncovering months of preparation, and that realization would change the entire direction of the investigation.
and this is the point where I stopped thinking what happened and started thinking how long had this been playing out?
Right?
Oh no, I said what I wanted to say.
Okay. I think investigators asked themselves that same question because as more evidence came in, this no longer looked like one tragic decision. It began to look like a carefully constructed timeline, and that timeline was about to be detected somewhere no one expected.
The answers investigators were searching for weren't hidden in one dramatic clue. They were scattered across months of digital breadcrumbs, waiting to be connected. And once those pieces came together, the lie that had fooled so many people began to unravel.
Before we move into the investigation, I think this is a good place to take a quick coffee break. Mom, how's that white chocolate mocha?
Well, it's still delicious, although I think it tastes a little different after this chat.
I know what you mean. If you're listening with us, this is a good time to refill your mug. We'll be right here when you get back because next we're following the evidence. Every investigator knows something the rest of us often forget. People can lie. Evidence usually doesn't. But the time detectives began reconstructing October 9th. They had hundreds of pieces of information: phone records, interview witnesses, surveillance footage, digital searches, receipts, cell phone data. Individually, none of those pieces answered the question. Together, they began telling a story one investigator believed had started long before October 9th.
And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about investigations. People imagine detectives finding one smoking gun, but most of the time it's hundreds of tiny details fitting together. We get used to like CSI and Law and Order, where they wrap it up in an hour.
Right.
Hmm.
Think of it like putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle. At first, every piece looks unrelated, but eventually the picture begins to appear. And that's exactly what happened here. Investigators began comparing Taylor's statement with what the evidence actually showed. As those timelines were compared, they found inconsistencies. And once again, one inconsistency doesn't solve the case, but several inconsistencies point investigators towards the truth.
The first question investigators asked was simple: where had everyone been that day? When they began examining surveillance footage and digital records, they were able to reconstruct movements, times, and locations. Technology became an important witness, not because technology solved the case, but because it preserved details people might never remember.
According to evidence presented during trial, investigators recovered internet searches and digital activity that prosecutors argued reflected planning. Standing alone, an internet search proves very little. People search for all kinds of things every day, literally off the
Hmm.
wall.
Right. Anything pops in my head.
Yeah, because if you check my search history, you'd be like, "What?"
Right.
What Adam
Especially doing this podcast.
Yeah,
Listen.
yes, they would be like, "Oh my goodness." But investigators don't look at one search by itself. They ask, "Does this fit with everything else we found?" When those searches were placed alongside witness testimony, phone records, and the timeline, prosecutors argued they painted a much larger picture.
And that's why context matters so much. One piece of evidence doesn't tell the whole story. But when dozens of pieces all point in the same direction, it's hard to ignore it.
Right. Evidence isn't about one dramatic moment, it's about patterns. And according to prosecutors, this investigation revealed a pattern they believed had been developing for months. Let's put ourselves in the investigator's shoes one more time. You've interviewed witnesses, reviewed surveillance, examined digital evidence. What's next? You start comparing every statement to every fact. Not because you expect everyone to lie, but because the truth is consistent. When something doesn't match, you ask why. That's what good investigators do. They don't begin with conclusions, they begin with questions. One thing we've learned while researching today's episode is how easy it is for myths to grow around high profile cases. You'll sometimes hear people say the internet solved this crime. It did. Detectives did. Digital evidence was one tool, just like witness interviews or forensic evidence. Justice wasn't built on one clue, it was built on careful investigative work.
I actually came away with a whole new appreciation for investigators. The patience it takes, the attention to detail, it's incredible.
Yeah, I do too. Because every piece of evidence represented one more opportunity to answer the question Reagan's family deserved to have answered. What happened? Little by little, the timeline became clear, the deception became clear, and eventually investigators believed they had enough evidence to present their case. The questions that had begun with a single heartbreaking day were now supported by months of investigation. The next step wouldn't belong to detectives, it would belong to 12 jurors because in our justice system, investigators uncover the facts. Jurors decide whether those facts prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
And that's such an important distinction. Investigators don't decide the guilt, the jury does.
Right. Which brings us to the courtroom, a place where every piece of evidence we've talked about would finally be examined, challenged, and weighed. Because the search for truth wasn't over. It was about to enter its final chapter. Yeah.
By the time this case reached the courtroom, the investigation was complete. Detectives had followed the evidence, experts had analyzed the forensic findings, and witnesses had been interviewed. Now the responsibility belonged to 12 jurors. Their job wasn't to decide whether the story was heartbreaking. Everyone already knew it was. Their job was to answer one question: had the state proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt?
Over the course of the trial, jurors heard testimony from investigators, medical experts, forensic specialists, friends, family members, and mental health professionals. The prosecution agreed that the evidence showed months of planning leading up to October 9th. The, deve- the defense The defense presented its own perspective, including testimony about Taylor's mental health and the profound emotional impact of her earlier hysterectomy. The jury was asked to consider all of it, not one piece of evidence, not one witness, the entire picture. And I'm sorry, I don't give a damn about your hysterectomy. That doesn't give you the right to literally snatch somebody's baby out of you.
That's right. And that's something I don't think people always appreciate. Trials aren't about proving one moment. They're about helping a jury understand an entire story through evidence.
Right. Every witness, every exhibit, every timeline, every expert opinion, the jury had to weigh all of it carefully. One question comes up again and again whenever people talk about this case. Was Taylor Parker legally insane? Which obviously that's an important question, right? Because legal insanity has a very specific meaning. Legal insanity has a very specific meaning. Mental health experts testified that Taylor had significant psychological issues, clearly. But after hearing that testimony, the jury did not find that she met legal standard for insanity. It's also important to remember something we've said throughout this episode. The overwhelming majority of people living with mental illness or personality disorders never commit violent crimes. Mental illness alone does not explain crime, and it should never become a stereotype.
I'm glad we're talking about that because I think it's easy to blur those lines if we're not careful.
Exactly. One of our responsibilities on this podcast is to separate what the evidence established from assumptions people make afterward. After considering the evidence, the jury reached its decision. Taylor Parker was found guilty of capital murder, and she was later sentenced to death as she should. For the legal system, the case had reached its conclusion, but for Reagan's family, it was another day without Reagan, another day without Braxton, and no verdict could ever restore the future they had imagined together. Oh, and that's really devastating.
Yeah.
Before we finish today's episode, we wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what the documentary couldn't explain.
Thing I appreciated about the documentary was that it never lost sight of Reagan. But like any documentary, there's only so much time.
Exactly. One detail we wanted to revisit is the concern expressed by Taylor's fiance's family. Watching them speak in the documentary, you can hear how conflicted they were. Some of them believed something wasn't right long before October 2020. That doesn't mean they knew what was coming. No one did, obviously. But it reminds us that this wasn't a story where everyone believed the deception. Some people trusted their instincts. Another important point is that the trial included hours of testimony that simply couldn't fit into a documentary. Witnesses described a longer history of deception that prosecutors argued showed a pattern rather than an isolated lie. Either or, I don't think that matters.
I don't think it matters. I think it just helps the prosecution submit exactly what was going on. But either way, she kills this woman.
She killed her. The defense challenged parts of that narrative, and the jury ultimately weighed that testimony alongside all the other.
It's like somebody hit the needle on a record.
Alongside all the other evidence. That's why we always encourage listeners to remember that documentaries are introductions, not complete case files.
Before she became the victim in a headline, Regan Simmons Hancock was a young woman excited about becoming a mom. She loved photography. She loved her family. She loved Homer. And she loved the little girl she couldn't wait to meet. That's how we hope you'll remember her. Not for the worst day of her life, but for the life she was building before that day ever came. And we remember Braxton, whose story is forever connected to her mother's. She was loved, she was wanted, and she mattered. I've been thinking about something all day.
And what is that?
When people finish this episode, I hope the first name they remember is Regan.
Me too. Because that's why we tell these stories, not to make infamous people more famous, but to make sure the people they hurt are never forgotten. Well, coffee crew, that's our last sip for today.
If today's story meant something to you, we'd love to hear from you. Yes. Tell us what's in your mug this week and tell us what stayed with you after today's conversation. Not about the crime, about the people, investigation, about the lessons. We'll share one coffee crew comment in our next episode.
And if you're enjoying these conversations, we'd be honored if you follow the podcast, leave a review, or share it with someone who enjoys thoughtful, compassionate true crime.
Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, behind every case file was a real person with dreams, family, and a future. Today, we shared a cup of coffee.
And remember, 2 lives.
Next time, co-conspirators.
Bye.